Okay, on spinning and toppling coins, did Martin Gardner change his mind? If so, that's okay. My name is Jim Weinrich. I teach statistics at San Diego State University. I'll bet you didn't know, according to a column that Martin Gardner wrote in Physics Teacher magazine, I'll bet you didn't know that if you spin a shiny new US penny, when it stops spinning, it will fall tails about 8 out of 10 times. Why? Because there's an imperceptible bias that occurs on the rims. Now, if I were an author, I would recycle my material. Martin did that in Magic Magazine in 1996. I'll bet you didn't know that if you spin a shiny new penny, it will fall tails about 8 out of 10 times, only this time it was improved with an illustration that shows the bias on the edge. He then did it again in two amazingly titled works, 1997, 2011, Science Magic, Martin Gardner's Tricks and Puzzles, and Martin Gardner's Science Magic, Tricks and Puzzles. The biased penny. I'll bet you didn't know that if you spin a shiny new US penny, when it stops spinning, it will fall wait a second, I thought I knew that it would fall tails. Now he's saying that it would fall heads. And he put in an extra, still because of the imperceptible bias in the rims. In both books, he added a new claim that involved toppling a penny balanced on its edge. And here he also said the bias was toward heads. He seemed to assume that the physical mechanism would be the same for both toppling and spinning, namely a bias in the edge. He might have been right. So in summary, in 1992, he said 80% tails. In 1996, he said 80% tails. 1997, he said 80% heads. And in 2011, 14 years later, he said 80% heads. Sometime along the way, this thing called the internet, you may have heard of, that happened. And now it seems that everyone says that spinning pennies fall heads up 80% of the time. You can go look it up. Basically, everybody says that. And many people say that this is because the head side is heavier. That's why it will fall down. They rarely mention any bias in the edges, which Martin had been talking about from day one. I'll bet you didn't know my data, which is the first time that I read Martin's book, I pulled a penny out of my pocket and it contradicted what he had said, but it was an old brown penny from 1964. So once I started teaching statistics, I found that spinning pennies in class was easy to turn into a class project. These pennies showed either no bias, or Martin's bias at 20%, or the opposite bias of 80%. And I found that Martin's change of mind could possibly have been based on, what a concept, actual data. I obtained pennies from various years, eBay is wonderful, and started spinning and spinning and spinning. And it turns out that there was indeed a very strong tails bias in the 1990s that continued up through 1994. Martin was correct. That's when the first book was published, and he presumably wrote it and proofread it a year or two earlier in his first column in the Physics magazine. But something changed in 1995's pennies. About then, Martin was presumably writing the book that would state a heads bias, not a tails bias. That was Games Puzzles 1, appeared at that point in the timeline. And my question to Jim Gardner, if I have any dollars due to me by ending sooner than 6 minutes, you and your brother were too old at that time, I think, to be spinning pennies for your dad. Do you know where he got his data? Were grandchildren perhaps involved? I don't know. And what happened thereafter? Well, it turns out that the bias evened out with an occasional exception. In 2012, it restored a tails bias, then it went to heads. And after that, it evened out again. So in closing, let me note that the physics of spinning coins is deceptive. Do spinning coins usually fall with their heavier side down? No. Physics says the heavier side usually will end up. That's coming from a non-physicist. Moreover, the head side of a penny is probably the lighter side, so the internet is doubly wrong. And do spinning coins with a biased edge usually fall with their narrower side down? Well, if you just let it fall down, yes. But if you spin it, no. Physics says that the narrower side usually will end facing up. What? According to physics, it all depends on where the coin's center of mass is. While spinning, the center of mass should be over the point on which the coin is spinning, so that tilts the heavier side facing up, and it tilts the narrower side facing up if you pay attention to the center of mass. unless I have my physics wrong, which I probably do. So finally, is there anybody out there who knows a lot about physics, somewhere in the audience? Maybe we could write a real paper about this. And also, is there anybody out there who knows about magic? Maybe a couple of you. Maybe we could create a magic trick around this, or fool Penn and Teller. They believe the 80% tails myth. I'm open. Thanks very much.